Henry Whitaker's polished leather shoes clicked against the polished tile floor of the bustling Vermont airport. Snowflakes swirled outside the vast windows, hinting at the blizzard rolling in. Travelers rushed around him, their faces alight with the joy of Christmas Eve. The air smelled faintly of pine and cinnamon, the unmistakable scent of holiday cheer. But for Henry, it might as well have been any other day. A sleek black carry-on rolled behind him as he checked his watch for the third time in 5 minutes. "Delayed," he muttered, glancing up at the flight board. The announcement of his plane to New York had been pushed back another hour. With an irritated sigh, he retreated to a quieter corner of the terminal, away from the chatter of families and children. Henry adjusted his tailored coat, his sharp features betraying no emotion. At 62, he was a man of habit and success, his wealth affording him anything he desired, except peace. This was his least favorite time of year, a period he associated with forced smiles and hollow gestures. His assistant had tried to cheer him earlier that day with a brightly wrapped gift and a Merry Christmas, but he had brushed it off. His daughter Caroline's voicemail had gone unanswered, her invitation to spend the holiday with her dismissed as unimportant. He didn't notice the small figure at first. She was crouched near a vending machine, her thin frame wrapped in a coat far too big for her. When she stood and stepped forward, she blocked his path with unexpected boldness. "Don't get on that plane," the girl said, her voice clear and firm. Henry blinked, taken aback. "Excuse me," he asked, his tone sharp. She was a waif of a child, no older than 10, with tangled brown hair poking out from beneath a knit cap. Her cheeks were flushed, not with warmth, but with the cold that clung to her clothes. Her wide hazel eyes locked onto his. "I said, don't get on that plane," she repeated. Her voice didn't waver, though she clutched a worn satchel to her chest as if seeking comfort. Henry frowned, his impatience flaring. "Listen, kid, I don't know what you think you're doing, but you'll regret it," she interrupted, taking a step closer. "I just know it." For a moment, Henry hesitated. There was something unnerving about the conviction in her words, but he quickly shook it off. "Run along, little girl," he said dismissively, attempting to sidestep her. She didn't move. Instead, her eyes seemed to search his, as if looking for something deeper. "Please," she said, her voice softening. "Just don't." Henry tightened his grip on his suitcase, ready to brush past her entirely, when the intercom crackled overhead. "Attention, passengers. Flight 237 to New York has been delayed by an additional hour due to weather conditions. We apologize for the inconvenience." His frustration deepened. He had no patience for this absurd interaction, but the delay gave the girl an opportunity to trail after him as he walked toward the nearest lounge. "Do you always ignore people who try to help you?" she asked, her voice carrying above the din of the airport. Henry stopped abruptly, turning on his heel. "What is it you want?" he demanded, exasperation lacing his words. "Money? A sandwich from that vending machine?" Her cheeks flushed with embarrassment, but she stood her ground. "I'm not asking for anything. I'm trying to save you." "Save me from what, exactly?" His tone was incredulous. The girl hesitated, biting her lower lip. She clutched her satchel tighter, as if the words were written inside and she wasn't sure how to deliver them. "From making a mistake," she said finally. Henry stared at her, utterly baffled. This wasn't a child begging for charity or someone playing a Christmas prank. She seemed sincere, but her words made no sense. "Look," he said, his voice softening just slightly. "You've got the wrong guy. I don't need saving. And frankly, I don't have time for this." She tilted her head, studying him with a mix of sadness and determination. "Maybe you don't think you do," she said quietly, "but you'll see." Before he could respond, a cheerful airport attendant in a Santa hat interrupted. "Sir, there's an issue with the seating on your flight. Would you mind stepping over to the counter to sort it out?" Henry took a relieved breath, glad for the distraction. Without another glance at the girl, he strode toward the counter. But as he walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling of her eyes on his back, nor the peculiar weight of her words. Something about her lingered, an unspoken truth buried in her plea. He forced the thought aside. After all, what could a child possibly know about a man like him? Henry stood at the counter, his jaw tight with irritation as he listened to the overly cheerful attendant explain the seating issue. Apparently, his first-class seat had been double-booked, and he was being asked to either downgrade to business class or wait for a later flight. His patience was wearing thin. "This is unacceptable," he said, his tone clipped. "I booked this flight weeks ago. I expect my seat to be available." The attendant nodded apologetically, her holiday spirit unwavering. "I completely understand, sir. We're working to resolve this as quickly as possible. If you'll just have a seat over there, I'll call you when we have an update." With a sharp exhale, Henry turned on his heel, heading to a quiet bench near the windows. Snow continued to fall heavily outside, blanketing the runways in a thick sheet of white. He glanced at his watch again, the seconds crawling by with excruciating slowness. As he settled into his seat, he noticed the girl again. She was perched on the edge of a chair several feet away, her satchel clutched tightly to her chest, her gaze fixed on him. "Still here?" he muttered under his breath. She nodded, her face calm but determined. "You didn't say yes or no," she said simply. "Yes or no to what?" "To not getting on that plane," she replied. "You still have a choice." Henry leaned back against the bench, a hollow laugh escaping his lips. "You're persistent, I'll give you that. But I'm not interested in playing games, kid. Don't you have somewhere to be? Family waiting for you, maybe?" Her expression faltered for a moment, the flicker of sadness in her eyes almost imperceptible. "No," she said softly. The word hung between them, heavier than the silence that followed. Against his better judgment, Henry felt a pang of curiosity. "No family?" he asked, though his voice lacked warmth. She shook her head. "Not anymore. My mom passed away last year. It's just me now." He hesitated, unsure how to respond. Sympathy wasn't something he offered easily, nor did he believe it would help. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, staring out at the snow instead. "And your dad?" he asked finally, the question coming out more gruffly than he intended. The girl's fingers tightened around the strap of her satchel. "I'm looking for him," she said, her voice steady but tinged with a quiet hope. "I know he's out there somewhere." Henry frowned. "And what makes you so sure?" She reached into her satchel, pulling out a folded piece of paper. Unfolding it carefully, she revealed a charcoal drawing of a man's face. The detail was astonishing, every line and shadow rendered with precision. Henry found himself leaning forward despite himself, studying the familiar features. It was impossible. He swallowed hard, his pulse quickening. The face on the paper wasn't just familiar. It was unmistakable. The sharp jawline, the mischievous glint in the eyes. It was his brother, Nathan. But that couldn't be. Nathan was dead. "Where did you get this?" he demanded, his voice sharper than he intended. The girl blinked at his sudden intensity. "I drew it," she said. "It's my dad. I've never met him, but my mom used to describe him to me when I was little. She said he had kind eyes and a smile that could light up a whole room." Henry stared at the drawing, his thoughts a chaotic tangle. Nathan had been gone for over a decade. The last time they'd spoken had been during an explosive argument about money, an argument that had severed their relationship. Shortly after, Nathan had disappeared. The news of his death in a car accident had reached Henry months later, leaving him with a lingering bitterness that he had never truly resolved. But now, looking at this drawing, he couldn't shake the feeling that the girl's story wasn't as far-fetched as it seemed. "What's your name?" he asked abruptly. "Maggie," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded slowly, the name settling uncomfortably in his mind. "Maggie, this man, your father, do you know where he might be?" She shook her head. "I've been looking for a long time. I thought maybe he'd be here, or maybe you'd know something." "Why would I know something?" Maggie hesitated, her gaze dropping to the drawing. "I don't know," she admitted, "but when I saw you, I just felt like I should ask. Like it was important." Henry let out a slow breath, his mind racing. The timing of this encounter, the uncanny resemblance of the drawing to Nathan, it all felt like too much to ignore. He didn't believe in fate, but he couldn't shake the thought that he was being pulled into something far bigger than himself. Against his better judgment, He folded the paper carefully and handed it back to her. "Maggie, I can't make any promises," he said slowly. "But maybe we can figure this out together." Her eyes widened, hope flickering to life. "Really? You'd help me?" He hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Let's just say I'm curious. And if there's any chance that this man is who I think he is, I owe it to myself and to him to find out." A smile spread across her face, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. It softened something in him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. The announcement of another flight delay crackled over the intercom, but this time, Henry didn't feel the usual annoyance. Instead, he felt something unexpected: purpose. Maybe, just maybe, this Christmas wouldn't be as empty as he'd imagined. The snow outside the airport thickened as the evening wore on, turning the windows into frosted canvases. Inside, the hum of holiday travelers buzzed around Henry and Maggie, who now sat together near the far end of the terminal. Their makeshift partnership had an uneasy start. Henry was still unsure why he had agreed to help this girl, and Maggie, for all her determination, seemed uncertain about trusting him completely. So, Henry began, breaking the silence between them. "How exactly have you been looking for your father?" Maggie pulled her knees up to her chest, her oversized coat swallowing her small frame. "I just go to places where I think he might be," she said. "Mom used to say he loved cities during the holidays. She said he'd always talk about finding magic in the lights and the people." Henry's lips tightened into a thin line. That sounded like something Nathan would have said. His younger brother had always been the dreamer, the one who found poetry in the ordinary and optimism in the bleak. It had been infuriating at times, Nathan's refusal to live in the real world, but it had also been what made him special. "You said he helped take care of you?" Henry asked, trying to piece the story together. Maggie nodded. "Before he disappeared. When my mom got sick, he'd show up sometimes. He never stayed long, but he'd always make sure we were okay." After her voice faltered, and she looked away, her fingers gripping the edge of her satchel. "After she passed, I thought he'd come back for me. But he didn't." Henry studied her, a strange mix of empathy and guilt swirling in his chest. He had spent years pretending his brother's death didn't bother him, burying himself in work and wealth to avoid the ache of their fractured relationship. But now, hearing this girl's story, he couldn't ignore the possibility that Nathan might still be out there, alive and alone. "Do you have any idea where he might be now?" Maggie hesitated, then reached into her satchel again. She pulled out a battered notebook, its pages filled with sketches and notes. She flipped to a specific page and handed it to Henry. "I heard someone talking about a man who plays guitar near Quincy Market," she said. "They said he's there most nights, but he never talks much. I thought it might be him." Henry looked at the sketch. It was a detailed drawing of a man sitting on a street corner, a guitar in his hands, a tattered hat on his head. The resemblance to Nathan was striking, but what caught Henry's attention was the way Maggie had captured the sadness in his expression. "Quincy Market, Boston. That wasn't far from here." "You think this is him?" he asked. "I don't know," Maggie admitted, "but I think it's worth checking." Henry leaned back in his chair, the weight of the decision pressing on him. He could just as easily walk away from all of this, board his plane, and continue his life as it was. But the thought of ignoring the possibility, of leaving behind the chance to find Nathan, to heal old wounds, was harder to swallow than he expected. The announcement for another delay crackled over the intercom. Henry glanced at Maggie, who was watching him with a mixture of hope and apprehension. "All right," he said finally. "Let's go." Maggie's face lit up, and for the first time, Henry felt a spark of warmth in his chest. It was faint, but it was there. The journey to Boston was slow and treacherous, the snowstorm blanketing the roads and reducing visibility to almost nothing. Henry had hired a car to drive them, insisting that flying was out of the question given the weather. Maggie sat quietly in the back seat beside him, her hands fidgeting nervously in her lap. "You're sure this is worth it?" Henry asked, glancing at her. She nodded. "I have to try. He's all I've got." Henry didn't respond, but her words lingered. He couldn't help but wonder if this search was more about her clinging to hope than about finding her father. But who was he to judge? Hope was a rare commodity, and he hadn't felt its pull in years. When they arrived in Boston, the city was almost unrecognizable beneath the storm's icy grip. The streets were quiet, save for the occasional cab splashing through slush. Henry and Maggie stepped out into the frigid air, and she immediately pulled her coat tighter around herself. "Where is Quincy Market from here?" Henry asked. Maggie pointed down the street, her breath visible in the cold. "That way." They walked in silence, the crunch of snow underfoot the only sound. When they reached the market, it was eerily empty. The usual holiday crowds had been driven away by the storm, leaving only a few hardy vendors and a smattering of street performers braving the cold. Maggie scanned the area, her eyes darting from face to face. Then, suddenly, she stopped. "There," she whispered, grabbing Henry's sleeve. He followed her gaze to a figure sitting on a low stone wall near the market's entrance. The man was bundled in layers of mismatched clothing, a guitar resting on his lap. He was strumming softly, the melody almost lost in the howling wind. Henry's breath caught. It was him, Nathan. His younger brother looked older than Henry remembered, his face weathered and his shoulders stooped. But there was no mistaking the familiar curve of his jaw, the way his fingers moved over the guitar strings with an ease born of years of practice. For a moment, Henry froze, unsure of what to do. But Maggie didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, her small voice cutting through the cold. "Tommy." The man looked up, his hands stilling on the guitar. His eyes, tired and shadowed, locked onto hers. And in that instant, everything began to change. Nathan, or Tommy, as Maggie had called him, stared at her, his fingers frozen over the strings of his guitar. His face was a mixture of confusion and disbelief, as though he was seeing a ghost. Maggie took another step forward, her voice trembling. "Is it you?" she asked, her breath visible in the icy air. Henry hung back, his pulse pounding in his ears. He hadn't seen his brother in over a decade, and now, here he was, alive and right in front of him. The moment felt surreal, like a dream teetering on the edge of reality. Tommy slowly rose to his feet, the guitar slipping from his lap to rest against the wall. He looked down at Maggie, his brow furrowed, and his hands trembled slightly as they hovered in the air between them. I don't understand," he said finally, his voice hoarse. Maggie pulled the worn notebook from her satchel, flipping to the drawing she had shown Henry. She held it up to him, her small hands steady despite the cold. "Mom told me about you," she said. "She said you'd come back." Tommy's face crumpled, and he stumbled back a step, his legs hitting the wall behind him. He lowered himself onto it, his hands clutching his face. She, he stammered, his voice cracking. Henry took a hesitant step forward, his boots crunching in the snow. "Nathan," he said, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. Tommy's head shot up at the sound of his real name. His eyes, now brimming with tears, widened as they met Henry's. "Henry," he whispered, as if saying the name aloud would confirm it was real. "It's me," Henry said, his throat tightening. "I thought you were dead." Nathan let out a shaky breath, his gaze darting between his brother and Maggie. I thought it was better if everyone believed that." Maggie took another step closer, her voice soft but insistent. "Why didn't you come back for me?" Nathan looked at her, and the weight of her words seemed to crush him. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. "I didn't know," he said, his voice muffled. "I didn't know about you." Maggie's face fell, and Henry moved closer, his own emotions a mix of anger, confusion, and something he couldn't quite name. "You didn't know?" Henry repeated. "Nathan, she's your daughter. How could you not know?" Nathan's hands dropped from his face, revealing eyes that were red and hollow. "Her mother. She never told me," he said. "The last time I saw her, we had an argument. I left and His voice broke, and he looked away, unable to finish the sentence. Maggie's lip quivered, but she stepped forward, closing the gap between them. "But you're here now," she said, her voice small but filled with a quiet determination. "We found you." Nathan reached out tentatively, his calloused hands trembling as they rested on Maggie's shoulders. He studied her face as if trying to memorize every detail. "I don't deserve this," he murmured. "I don't deserve you." Henry watched the exchange, his own emotions boiling beneath the surface. The last time he'd seen Nathan, their argument had ended with words that couldn't be taken back. Nathan had accused him of abandoning family in favor of ambition, and Henry had called him a failure. Now, standing here, he couldn't help but wonder if he'd been wrong. "You didn't tell anyone you were alive," Henry said, his voice tight. "You let us think you were gone. Do you have any idea what that did to everyone?" Nathan flinched, guilt etched into every line of his face. "I thought it would be easier," he said. "I had nothing to offer. No job, no money. I'd burned every bridge I had. I thought the best thing I could do was disappear." Henry shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "And now? Living like this, out here in the cold? Playing guitar on street corners?" Nathan's eyes hardened, and for a moment, the defiance Henry remembered so well flickered to life. "It's not much," he said, "but it's mine. And it's more honest than the life I was living before." Maggie stepped between them, her small hands held up as if trying to stop a fight before it could begin. "Stop," she said firmly. "Please. It's Christmas." The simplicity of her plea cut through the tension, and both men fell silent. Nathan looked at her, his expression softening. "You're right," he said quietly. "It's Christmas, and I'm sorry. For all of it." Henry swallowed hard, his chest tightening. The years of resentment and unanswered questions swirled in his mind, but Maggie's words lingered. It was Christmas, and maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to make things right. "You have a lot to make up for," Henry said, his voice gentler now. "But she found you, Nathan. That means something." Nathan nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Maggie. "It means everything," he said. "I don't know how to fix this, but I'll try. I promise." Maggie stepped forward, wrapping her arms around him. For a moment, Nathan seemed stunned, but then he returned the embrace, holding her tightly. Henry looked away, giving them a moment of privacy. His own emotions churned within him, a mix of relief, sadness, and hope. He didn't know what the future held for his brother or this girl who had so stubbornly refused to give up. But for the first time in years, he felt something stir within him, a sense of possibility. The snow continued to fall, muffling the world around them. But in that quiet moment, it seemed as though the cold and the past no longer mattered. There was only now, and the chance to begin again. The wind carried a chill that cut through the quiet streets of Boston, but the three of them, Henry, Nathan, and Maggie, hardly noticed as they made their way to a small cafe nearby. The warmth inside was a welcome contrast to the storm outside, the soft hum of conversation and the scent of fresh coffee offering a sense of comfort none of them had expected to find tonight. Maggie sat across from Nathan, clutching a steaming mug of hot chocolate in her small hands. She looked at him as if she were trying to memorize every detail of his face, as though he might disappear again if she blinked. Nathan, for his part, seemed overwhelmed, his fingers tracing the rim of his own mug as he searched for words. Henry sat off to the side, watching the two of them. He felt like an outsider, unsure of his place in this reunion. His thoughts raced, a mix of old grievances and the sudden weight of responsibility. He had come to Boston for answers, and while he had found some, they had only deepened the questions. Finally, Nathan broke the silence. "How long have you been on your own, Maggie?" he asked, his voice quiet. Maggie hesitated, her gaze dropping to her mug. "Since last Christmas," she said. "After Mom passed, I stayed with a neighbor for a while. But she had her own family, and I didn't want to be a burden. So I left." Nathan's face crumpled, his hand reaching out instinctively to cover hers. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. "You should never have had to go through that. If I'd known." Maggie looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of sadness and forgiveness. "You didn't know," she said simply. "But you're here now." The simplicity of her words struck Henry. Maggie's resilience and capacity for forgiveness were staggering. He had spent years letting his anger toward Nathan fester, and here was this young girl, ready to move forward with a father she barely knew. Henry cleared his throat, drawing their attention. "Nathan," he said, his tone more measured than before. "We need to figure out what happens next. Maggie can't keep living like this, and you—" He hesitated, searching for the right words. "You need to get back on your feet." Nathan nodded, his expression solemn. "You're right," he said. "I want to do better. For her." Maggie looked at Nathan with a shy smile. "I can help," she offered. "I'm good at drawing. Maybe I could sell some of my sketches, and we could save up for a place." Nathan's eyes filled with tears, and he reached out to take her hands in his. "You shouldn't have to do that," he said. "It's my job to take care of you now." Henry watched the exchange, his heart softening despite himself. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms as he studied his brother. "Do you have any leads on work?" Nathan shook his head. "It's been hard to hold down anything steady," he admitted. "The guitar helps, but it's not much." Henry sighed, a part of him frustrated by Nathan's lack of direction. But he reminded himself that rebuilding a life didn't happen overnight. He glanced at Maggie, who was now sketching something on a napkin, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Maggie," he said gently, "can I see what you're working on?" She looked up, a little startled, but slid the napkin across the table. It was a quick sketch of the cafe, capturing its warmth and the people inside with a precision that made Henry pause. "This is incredible," he said, genuinely impressed. "You have real talent." Maggie blushed, ducking her head. "Thanks," she murmured. Nathan smiled at her, pride evident in his eyes. "She gets that from her mom," he said softly. "Rachel was always sketching something. She had this way of making even the simplest things look beautiful." Henry felt a pang at the mention of Rachel. He remembered her as kind and full of life, the perfect counterbalance to Nathan's restless energy. He hadn't known her well, but it was clear that she had left an indelible mark on both Nathan and Maggie. "Maybe we could find a way to use your talent," Henry said thoughtfully, addressing Maggie. "There are galleries and markets that feature young artists. It could be a start." Maggie's eyes lit up, and she looked at Nathan for confirmation. "Could we?" Nathan hesitated, then nodded. "If that's what you want, we'll try," he said. Henry leaned forward, his tone firm. "It's not just about trying, Nathan. You need to commit to this, for her and for yourself. I know things haven't been easy for you, but you can't keep running." Nathan's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Instead, he looked at Maggie and nodded. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said. The conversation turned to practical matters, finding a temporary place for Nathan and Maggie to stay, connecting with local resources for work, and exploring opportunities for Maggie's art. As the plans began to take shape, Henry felt a surprising sense of hope. It wasn't perfect, and it wouldn't be easy, but it was a start. When they left the cafe, the snow had stopped, and the city was blanketed in a quiet stillness. The three of them stood together for a moment, taking it all in. Maggie looked up at Nathan, her expression serious. "Will you stay this time?" she asked. Nathan knelt in front of her, placing his hands on her shoulders. "I'm not going anywhere," he said firmly. "I promise." Henry watched them, his chest tightening with a mix of emotions. He still didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like they were moving in the right direction. "Come on," he said, motioning toward a waiting cab. "Let's get you two settled. Tomorrow's a new day." As they climbed into the cab, Maggie nestled between Henry and Nathan, the warmth of their presence chasing away the lingering cold. For the first time in years, Henry felt the faint flicker of something he had nearly forgotten: peace. The next morning, the city was calm under a bright layer of snow, glittering in the pale sunlight that seeped through the clouds. Henry had arranged for Nathan and Maggie to stay at a modest inn not far from the heart of Boston, a temporary solution until they could figure out a more permanent arrangement. Despite the simplicity of the room, Maggie had been thrilled, leaping onto the bed with a childlike enthusiasm that brought a rare smile to Henry's face. Now, as he sat in the small breakfast room with Nathan, the two brothers faced each other over cups of coffee. Maggie was still upstairs, engrossed in her sketchbook, leaving them to navigate the awkwardness of a conversation that had been delayed by over a decade. Nathan looked older than Henry remembered, and not just because of the years that had passed. There was a weariness in his eyes, a kind of resignation that spoke of too many hard days and too few moments of peace. Henry felt an urge to say something meaningful, but the weight of their shared past hung between them like an invisible barrier. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again," Henry said finally, breaking the silence. Nathan nodded, his gaze fixed on the table. "I didn't think you'd want to." Henry frowned. "Why would you think that?" Nathan let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "We didn't exactly part on good terms, did we? The last thing you said to me was that I was a failure who couldn't even keep his life together." The memory stung, even after all this time. Henry ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration and regret. "I didn't mean it," he said, though the words felt hollow even to him. "I was angry. You were leaving everything behind, and I didn't understand why." Nathan finally looked up, his expression guarded. "You didn't try to understand," he said. "You just saw me as a problem, something to fix or discard." Henry opened his mouth to argue, but stopped himself. Nathan wasn't wrong. Back then, he had been so focused on control, on building his business, on protecting the family name, that he hadn't seen Nathan's struggles for what they were. "I made mistakes," Henry admitted, his voice quieter now. "More than I can count. But if I could go back, I'd do things differently." Nathan studied him for a long moment, as if trying to gauge the sincerity in his words. Finally, he sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I guess we both made mistakes," he said. "But what matters now is Maggie. She deserves better than what I've given her so far." Henry nodded, grateful for the shift in focus. "She's a remarkable kid," he said. "She's been through so much, but she still has hope." "That's rare." Nathan's expression softened. "She's her mother's daughter," he said. "Rachel was always the strongest person I knew. She believed in me when no one else did, even when I didn't deserve it." Henry hesitated, unsure if he should ask the question that had been on his mind since last night. Finally, he decided to take the risk. "Why didn't you reach out after Rachel passed?" he asked. "Even if you didn't know about Maggie, you could have let someone know you were alive." Nathan looked away, his jaw tightening. "I thought about it," he said. 100 times, I thought about it. But what would I have said? "Hey, I'm not dead, but I've been living on the streets and playing guitar for spare change." I didn't want to drag anyone else into my mess. Henry leaned forward, his tone firm but not unkind. "You don't get to decide that for other people, Nathan. You don't get to vanish and think that's somehow sparing us. Do you have any idea what it was like to think you were gone? To never have the chance to make things right?" Nathan flinched, and for a moment, Henry thought he might lash out. But instead, his shoulders slumped, and he let out a heavy breath. "I thought I was doing the right thing," he said. "But I see now that I was just running. I've been running my whole life." Henry sat back, giving him a moment to collect himself. He wanted to say more, to push Nathan to confront the choices that had led him here. But he knew better than to force it. People didn't change overnight, and the fact that Nathan was even here, sitting across from him, was more than he dared to hope for. Maggie appeared a few minutes later, her face bright with excitement. She held up her sketchbook, showing them a new drawing she'd been working on. A bustling Christmas market filled with lights and smiling faces. "Do you think we can go somewhere like this?" she asked, her eyes sparkling. "I've never been to one before." Nathan smiled, the tension in his face easing as he looked at her. "I think we can manage that," he said. Henry glanced at his watch. "There's a market downtown," he said. "We could head there this afternoon." Maggie beamed, and for a moment, the weight of everything seemed to lift. The Christmas market was everything Maggie had hoped for. The air was filled with the scent of roasted chestnuts and spiced cider, and the stalls were brimming with handmade ornaments, colorful scarves, and twinkling lights. Maggie darted from one stall to the next, her enthusiasm contagious. Nathan and Henry followed behind, their pace slower but no less affected by the festive atmosphere. Nathan seemed lighter here, as if the simple joy of the moment was enough to ease the burden he carried. Henry watched his brother carefully, noticing the way he smiled at Maggie's delight, the way he seemed to stand a little taller. At one stall, Maggie found a set of small charcoal pencils and a pad of thick, textured paper. She looked at Nathan with wide, pleading eyes, and he laughed, pulling a few crumpled bills from his pocket. "It's a Christmas present," he said, handing the money to the vendor. Maggie threw her arms around him, her gratitude so genuine it brought a lump to Henry's throat. As the afternoon faded into evening, the three of them sat on a bench near the center of the market, sharing a bag of warm sugared almonds. Maggie sketched furiously in her new pad, her tongue poking out slightly as she concentrated. Nathan and Henry sat in companionable silence, the tension between them easing with each passing moment. For the first time in years, Henry felt something he hadn't realized he'd been missing, a sense of connection, of belonging. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was real. And that, he thought, was more than enough. The days leading up to Christmas passed in a blur of quiet but profound moments. Nathan, Maggie, and Henry found themselves settling into a rhythm that none of them could have anticipated. While the snow continued to pile up outside, they spent their time indoors at the small inn or exploring the city, piecing together fragments of a new life. Maggie seemed to thrive in the calm. Her sketchbook rarely left her side, and every few minutes, she'd stop to capture something that caught her eye. A bundled-up couple holding hands, a street performer juggling in the cold, or a small bird perched on a snowy branch. Nathan would watch her, pride and regret battling for dominance in his expression. Henry saw it too, and felt a growing determination to help his brother succeed where he had once faltered. One evening, Henry arranged for dinner at a nearby restaurant, a cozy spot lit by soft candlelight and adorned with Christmas garlands. Maggie's eyes widened as they stepped inside, the warmth of the room and the hum of conversation wrapping around them like a comforting embrace. "This is so fancy," she whispered to Nathan, clutching his hand tightly. "It's not too fancy," Nathan said, smiling. "Besides, you deserve something special." They sat at a table by the window, the snow outside creating a picture-perfect backdrop. Maggie studied the menu with fascination, while Henry and Nathan exchanged quiet glances, the silence between them more reflective than strained. After they ordered, Henry leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. "Nathan, I've been thinking about what comes next," he said, his tone serious but not harsh. Nathan tensed slightly but nodded. "I have too," he replied. "I know things can't stay the way they are. I need to find steady work, a place for Maggie and me to live. I can't keep relying on your generosity." "It's not about generosity," Henry said firmly. "It's about giving you the foundation you need to rebuild. But you have to meet me halfway." Nathan looked down at his hands, his jaw tightening. "I will," he said. "I don't know how yet, but I will." Henry nodded. "I've been asking around. A friend of mine owns a gallery in the city. They sometimes hire artists to teach workshops, especially to kids. Maggie might have a real shot at something there." Maggie's head shot up, her eyes wide with surprise. "Me?" she asked, her voice filled with a mix of excitement and disbelief. "You think I could teach other kids?" Henry smiled. "I think you have talent, and talent deserves to be nurtured." Nathan placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression soft. "What do you think, Maggie? Would you like to try?" She nodded quickly, her cheeks flushed with excitement. "I'd love to," she said, clutching her sketchbook protectively. "But would they really let me?" "They will," Henry assured her. "I'll make sure of it." Nathan's gratitude was evident in his eyes, though he didn't say anything. Instead, he reached for his glass of water, taking a slow sip as he composed himself. Henry knew his brother was still wrestling with the idea of accepting help, but he also knew it was necessary. This wasn't about pride. It was about survival, for both Nathan and Maggie. The meal passed with lighter conversation after that, Maggie's enthusiasm carrying them through any lingering awkwardness. By the time dessert arrived, a shared plate of warm apple pie with vanilla ice cream, there was laughter at the table, the kind that felt natural and unforced. After dinner, as they walked back to the inn, Maggie skipped ahead, her footsteps leaving a trail of small imprints in the fresh snow. Nathan watched her, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. He looked at Henry, his expression unreadable. "She's amazing, isn't she?" Nathan said, his voice low. Henry nodded. "She is. She's got Rachel's spirit." Nathan smiled faintly. She does. And I see now how much I've missed. I don't know how I'm ever going to make it up to her. You start by being there, Henry said. Every day. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to show up. Nathan didn't respond, but the resolve in his eyes was clear. Henry felt a flicker of hope, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. The following day, Henry took Maggie to the gallery he'd mentioned. Nathan hesitated at first, worried about being out of place, but Henry insisted he come along. The gallery was a bright, welcoming space filled with colorful artwork from local artists. The owner, a kind woman named Elaine, greeted them warmly and listened attentively as Henry explained Maggie's talent. Maggie shyly showed her sketchbook, flipping through the pages to reveal her work. Elaine's face lit up as she examined each drawing, her appreciation genuine and immediate. "These are incredible," Elaine said. "You have a real gift, Maggie." Maggie beamed, her confidence growing with every word of praise. Nathan stood nearby, his hands tucked into his coat pockets, his expression a mix of pride and uncertainty. Elaine offered to display some of Maggie's work in a special showcase for young artists, an opportunity that left her speechless. When Maggie finally found her voice, she agreed eagerly, clutching her sketchbook to her chest as if it were the most precious thing in the world. Nathan thanked Elaine profusely, his gratitude spilling out in a rush of words. Henry watched from the side, his heart swelling with something unfamiliar but welcome, a sense of purpose. Later that evening, as they sat together in the inn's small sitting room, Maggie worked on a new sketch, her face lit with determination. Nathan and Henry sat nearby, sipping cups of coffee and sharing quiet conversation. "You did a good thing today," Nathan said, glancing at Henry. "For her."
"For us."
Henry shrugged, his expression thoughtful. "It's not about me. It's about giving her a chance to shine. She deserves that." Nathan nodded, his gaze drifting to Maggie. "She's the best thing I've ever done," he said quietly, "and I'm not going to let her down again." For the first time in years, Henry believed him. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but they had taken the first steps together. And in that moment, it felt like enough. The snow outside continued to fall, but inside, the warmth of hope and determination filled the room. They were no longer three separate lives moving in isolation, but a small, imperfect family finding their way back to each other. And for Henry, that was a kind of miracle he hadn't known he needed. The next few days brought a flurry of activity and new beginnings for Nathan, Maggie, and Henry. The gallery agreed to feature several of Maggie's sketches in their upcoming showcase, giving her a renewed sense of purpose. She threw herself into her art with determination, working late into the evenings at the small desk in their room. Nathan often sat beside her, watching her draw with a mixture of awe and pride, while Henry worked quietly in the background, handling logistics to ensure everything went smoothly. As Christmas Eve approached, the city grew brighter with twinkling lights and the sound of carolers filling the air. The bustling streets seemed to embody the spirit of the season, a warmth that contrasted with the chill of the snow-covered sidewalks. For the first time in years, Henry found himself looking forward to the holiday, though he wasn't quite sure why. Perhaps it was Maggie's infectious excitement, or the tentative progress he saw in Nathan. Either way, it felt different this year, lighter, more hopeful. That evening, they returned to the gallery for a special pre-show reception. Elaine, the owner, had insisted on hosting a small gathering to highlight the young artists featured in the showcase. Maggie dressed carefully, wearing a simple red dress Nathan had bought for her with the last of his savings. Henry, noticing the worn shoes that accompanied her outfit, had quietly arranged for a new pair to be waiting for her at the inn. Maggie's eyes had lit up with joy when she saw them, and she hugged him tightly, her gratitude overflowing. The gallery was filled with people when they arrived, the warm glow of the lights reflecting off the polished wooden floors. Maggie clutched her sketchbook nervously as they entered, her confidence wavering for the first time. Nathan placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, bending down to whisper, "You've got this, kid. Just be yourself." Henry stood behind them, his presence steady and calm. "They're going to love your work," he said. "Just like we do." Maggie smiled hesitantly, taking a deep breath before stepping into the room. The walls were lined with artwork from other young artists, each piece telling its own story. Maggie's section was prominently displayed near the center, her sketches mounted carefully on white matting. People had already gathered around her work, admiring the detail and emotion in each piece. Elaine spotted them and made her way over, her face lighting up. "There's the star of the evening," she said warmly, crouching slightly to meet Maggie's eyes. "How are you feeling?" Maggie hesitated, but then smiled. "Nervous," she admitted, "but excited too." "That's a good sign," Elaine said. "Come on, let me introduce you to a few people." Maggie looked at Nathan for reassurance, and he nodded, his pride evident. "Go ahead," he said. "We'll be right here." As Maggie followed Elaine into the crowd, Nathan and Henry moved to the side, watching her navigate the room with growing confidence. She spoke softly but passionately about her work, her face lighting up whenever someone praised her talent. Nathan crossed his arms, his expression a mix of pride and something deeper. Regret, perhaps, for the time he had lost. "She's incredible," Nathan said quietly, more to himself than to Henry. "She is," Henry agreed. "And so are you, for raising her the way you did. Even if it wasn't perfect." Nathan shook his head. "I don't deserve credit for her strength. That's all Rachel. I was barely there." "You're here now," Henry said firmly. "And that's what matters." Nathan didn't respond, but his jaw tightened, his focus remaining on Maggie as she charmed the room. It was clear to Henry that Nathan was still grappling with his past, the choices that had led him to this moment. But there was also determination in his posture, a resolve to do better moving forward. As the evening continued, Maggie's confidence grew. She mingled with the guests, answering questions about her sketches and even sharing a few stories about the inspiration behind them. At one point, a local journalist approached her, intrigued by her work and her story. Maggie looked to Nathan and Henry for approval, and they both nodded, encouraging her to share as much as she felt comfortable. The journalist, a kind woman with a warm smile, knelt to speak with Maggie at eye level. "Your work is beautiful," she said. "It's rare to see such emotion in sketches. Can I ask what inspires you?" Maggie hesitated for a moment, then said, "People, I think. The way they live, how they feel. I like to draw things that tell a story." "That's a wonderful way to put it," the journalist said. "And you've been through quite a story yourself, haven't you?" Maggie glanced at Nathan, who gave her a small nod. She took a deep breath before answering. "Yeah, but it's not just about the hard parts," she said. "It's about what comes after. The good stuff." The journalist smiled, clearly impressed. "That's a beautiful perspective, Maggie. I think a lot of people could learn from you." After the interview, Maggie returned to Nathan and Henry, her face glowing with excitement. "Did you hear that?" she asked. "She said my story could help people." Nathan knelt in front of her, his hands resting on her shoulders. "Your story already helps people," he said, "and you don't even know it." Henry watched the exchange, a strange warmth spreading through him. He had spent so much of his life focused on his own success, chasing goals that felt hollow now in comparison to the joy on Maggie's face. For the first time in years, he felt connected to something real, something meaningful. As the evening wound down, Elaine approached them with a wide smile. "Maggie, your sketches have been a huge hit," she said. "I've had several people express interest in buying them. What do you think about that?" Maggie's eyes widened, and she looked at Nathan for guidance. He grinned, his pride unmistakable. "I think you should say yes," he said. Maggie nodded eagerly, turning back to Elaine. "Yes, I'd love that." Elaine laughed, clearly delighted. "Wonderful. We'll set up everything for you. I think this is just the beginning for you, Maggie." As they left the gallery that night, the weight of the world felt just a little lighter. Maggie held her sketchbook tightly, her steps practically bouncing as they walked through the snow. Nathan walked beside her, his arm resting protectively around her shoulders, while Henry followed close behind, his heart full. For the first time in a long time, Henry felt like he belonged, not just to his family but to something greater. And as they made their way back to the inn, the lights of the city twinkling around them, he knew that this Christmas would be one he would never forget. It wasn't about the gifts or the success. It was about the people he had found again, the connections that made life worth living. And for that, he was profoundly grateful. The morning of Christmas Eve arrived with a stillness that seemed almost magical. The snow from the previous night blanketed the streets in pure white, muffling the sounds of the bustling city. The air was crisp but not biting, the kind of winter day that felt like a gift in itself. Inside the inn, the three of them prepared for the day ahead, each with a quiet sense of purpose. Maggie had been up before dawn, adding the final touches to a new piece she wanted to show Elaine at the gallery. It was a sketch of the Christmas market they'd visited, filled with joyful details. Children bundled up in scarves, strings of twinkling lights, and vendors with warm smiles. She'd poured her heart into it, and it showed. Nathan had watched her work from across the room, his expression a mix of admiration and quiet pride. Henry, meanwhile, had taken it upon himself to organize a surprise for the two of them. He'd been making a few discreet phone calls over the past couple of days, setting plans into motion. It was something he hadn't done in years, planning something personal, meaningful, rather than purely transactional. The idea had come to him after seeing the way Maggie lit up at the gallery, the way Nathan seemed to soften in her presence. He wanted to give them something they could carry with them into this new chapter of their lives. As they sat down for breakfast in the inn's small dining room, Henry could feel the anticipation building. Maggie was bubbling with excitement about her sketch, chattering animatedly about how she hoped Elaine would love it. Nathan was more subdued, but there was a quiet warmth in his demeanor, a far cry from the guarded man Henry had first encountered days ago. "Are we heading to the gallery this morning?" Maggie asked between bites of toast, her wide eyes filled with hope. "We are," Henry said, smiling, "but we've got a few stops to make first." Maggie tilted her head in curiosity, but Nathan raised an eyebrow. "Stops? Like what?" he asked. "You'll see," Henry replied, keeping his tone light. "Let's just say it's a little Christmas surprise." Maggie's face lit up, and she clapped her hands together. "I love surprises." Nathan chuckled softly, shaking his head. "All right, big brother, lead the way." Their first stop was a small boutique not far from the inn. Henry had arranged for the shop to open early just for them, and the owner greeted them warmly as they stepped inside. Maggie's eyes widened as she took in the racks of winter coats, scarves, and boots. "Pick something," Henry said, gesturing toward the rows of children's clothing. "Something warm. And don't argue," he added when Nathan opened his mouth to protest. Maggie hesitated, glancing at Nathan for approval. He gave her a small nod, and she grinned, darting toward a rack of colorful coats. Within minutes, she had found a bright blue coat lined with faux fur, matching gloves, and a knitted hat with a pom-pom on top. She tried them on, spinning in front of the mirror with delight. "You look perfect," Nathan said, his voice thick with emotion. Henry smiled, watching them from the side. "Now, you'll be ready for any weather Boston throws at you." Their next stop was a bookstore down the street, where Henry handed Maggie a gift card and encouraged her to choose a few books for herself. She wandered the aisles with wide-eyed wonder, eventually selecting a mix of sketching guides and adventure stories. Nathan followed her closely, occasionally picking up a book to glance at the cover before returning it to the shelf. While they waited for Maggie to finish, Henry turned to Nathan. "I know you're not used to this," he said quietly, "but it's not about charity. It's about giving her what she deserves." Nathan sighed, nodding slowly. "I know," he said. "It's just hard. Letting someone else take care of things." Henry clapped him on the shoulder. "You're taking care of her in the ways that matter most. Let me help with the rest." By the time they reached the gallery, Maggie was practically glowing, her arms full of books and her new coat snug around her small frame. Elaine greeted them at the door, her smile widening when she saw the sketch Maggie had brought. "This is beautiful," Elaine said, studying the drawing. "You have such an incredible eye for detail, Maggie. I think this will be the centerpiece of the show." Maggie's cheeks flushed with pride, and she glanced at Nathan, who nodded encouragingly. "Thank you," she said softly. "I worked really hard on it." As they prepared to leave, Elaine pulled Henry aside. "You've done a wonderful thing for her," she said. "It's clear she's talented, but more than that, she's finding her confidence." "That's priceless." Henry nodded, his throat tightening. "She's special," he said simply. Their final stop of the day was the surprise Henry had been planning. He led them to a small house on the outskirts of the city, its front porch dusted with snow. The property was modest but well kept, with a cozy charm that seemed to invite them in. "What's this?" Nathan asked, his brow furrowing. "It's yours," Henry said, pulling a set of keys from his pocket. "A fresh start. It's rented for now, but if things go well, we can talk about making it permanent." Nathan stared at him, disbelief written across his face. "Henry, I can't. This is too much." "It's not," Henry said firmly. "It's what you need. What she needs. You're not doing this alone anymore, Nathan." Maggie's eyes filled with tears as she looked up at Nathan. "We have a house," she whispered. Nathan knelt beside her, pulling her into a tight hug. "Yeah, kid," he said, his voice breaking. "We have a house." As they stepped inside, the warmth of the home enveloped them, the faint scent of pine lingering in the air. The living room was already decorated with a small Christmas tree, its branches adorned with simple ornaments and twinkling lights. A stack of wrapped gifts sat beneath it, placed there by Henry's careful planning. Maggie rushed to the tree, her laughter filling the room as she examined the ornaments. Nathan stood in the doorway, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his expression a mix of awe and gratitude. Henry joined him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "This is your chance, Nathan," he said, "to give her the life she deserves. Don't waste it." Nathan nodded, his eyes glistening. "I won't," he said. "I promise." As the evening wore on, they settled into the house, sharing a simple meal and exchanging stories by the fire. For the first time in years, Henry felt at peace, the weight of the past finally lifting. This wasn't just a house, it was a home, a place where they could rebuild together. And as the clock struck midnight, signaling the arrival of Christmas, Henry knew they had all received the greatest gift of all, a second chance. Christmas morning arrived with a quiet serenity, the kind of stillness that felt almost sacred. The house was warm and filled with the faint smell of cinnamon and pine, the tree lights casting a soft glow over the living room. Maggie was the first to wake, her excitement spilling over as she padded downstairs in her new blue coat, which she refused to take off even to sleep. The sight of the small stack of presents under the tree made her gasp, and for a moment, she simply stood there, taking it all in. She had never woken up to a scene like this before, not even when her mother was alive. Tears pricked the corners of her eyes, but they were happy tears, ones she didn't try to brush away. Nathan appeared in the doorway a few moments later, his hair still messy from sleep. He paused when he saw Maggie by the tree, her hands clasped in front of her as if she were afraid to disturb the moment. "Merry Christmas, kiddo," he said, his voice soft. She turned, a radiant smile lighting up her face. "Merry Christmas," she replied, running to him and wrapping her arms around his waist. Nathan hugged her tightly, his eyes closing as he held her. He had made her a promise, and for the first time in years, he felt like he was keeping one. Henry joined them soon after, carrying 3 steaming mugs of cocoa. He handed one to Maggie and another to Nathan, pausing to take in the scene. It was a stark contrast to the sterile Christmases he had spent alone in his Manhattan apartment, where the holiday was marked only by a half-hearted email from his assistant or a perfunctory phone call from his daughter. This, he realized, was what the season was meant to feel like: connection, warmth, and purpose. Maggie insisted they start with presents, and neither man could argue with her enthusiasm. She carefully unwrapped each gift, her joy bubbling over with every item she pulled from the paper. There was a new set of art supplies from Henry, a scarf Nathan had picked out at a market, and even a pair of fluffy socks that Maggie immediately declared her new favorite. When it was Nathan's turn, he unwrapped a leather-bound notebook Henry had chosen for him. The inscription on the inside cover read, "For your stories, past, present, and future." Nathan ran his fingers over the smooth pages, his throat tight as he looked at his brother. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice thick with emotion. Henry nodded, his own feelings too complex to put into words. He had never been one for sentimental gestures, but something about this Christmas felt different. He didn't just want to give. He wanted to connect, to bridge the gaps that years of silence and regret had created. As they finished unwrapping the gifts, Maggie picked up her sketchbook and plopped onto the floor by the tree. She began sketching the scene in front of her. The cozy room, the twinkling lights, and the two men who had become her entire world. "Do you ever stop drawing?" Nathan teased, leaning back against the couch with a grin. Maggie shook her head, her pencil moving swiftly across the page. "Nope," she said. "There's too much to draw." Nathan laughed, a sound that surprised even himself. Henry watched the exchange, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He had forgotten what it felt like to be part of something like this. A family, however imperfect, finding joy in the simple moments. Later in the day, they ventured outside to explore the neighborhood. The snow glistened under the bright winter sun, and Maggie delighted in making snow angels in the front yard. Nathan joined her, his laughter echoing through the crisp air as he attempted to perfect his own snow angel. Henry stood back, watching them with a mixture of amusement and something deeper, a quiet contentment he hadn't felt in years. When they returned to the house, their cheeks pink from the cold, Maggie insisted they bake cookies. Nathan and Henry exchanged skeptical glances, but neither of them could say no to her. The kitchen quickly turned into a chaotic mess of flour, sugar, and spilled chocolate chips, but the laughter that filled the room more than made up for it. Maggie took her role as cookie decorator very seriously, carefully placing sprinkles and icing on each one. Nathan, meanwhile, managed to burn the first batch, much to Maggie's dismay. Henry stepped in to oversee the second round, his meticulous nature proving surprisingly helpful in the kitchen. By the time they sat down to dinner that evening, the house smelled like sugar and warmth, the kind of scent that lingered long after the meal was over. They ate at the small wooden table, passing dishes back and forth, the conversation flowing easily. Nathan shared stories from his days as a musician, while Maggie chimed in with tales of her adventures in the city. Henry listened more than he spoke, but when he did contribute, his words carried weight. As the evening drew to a close, they gathered in the living room once more. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow over the room. Maggie curled up in her new coat, her sketchbook balanced on her knees as she added the finishing touches to her drawing. Nathan glanced at Henry, his expression thoughtful. "You know," he said, his voice low, "I wasn't sure what to expect when we came here. But this feels like home." Henry looked at him, his chest tightening. "It is home," he said simply, "for all of us." Nathan nodded, a small smile playing at his lips. "Thank you," he said, "for everything." Henry shook his head. "You don't have to thank me. Just promise me you'll make the most of it." "I will," Nathan said. "We both will." Maggie looked up from her sketchbook, her face bright. "Can we stay here forever?" she asked, her voice filled with hope. Nathan reached over, ruffling her hair. "We'll stay as long as we can," he said, "and we'll make it ours." As the fire burned low and the room grew quiet, Henry found himself reflecting on the past few days. He had come to Boston expecting nothing more than answers to old questions, but what he had found was something much greater. He had found a second chance, not just for Nathan and Maggie, but for himself. For the first time in years, he felt whole, and as he sat there, watching the two of them, he realized that this was the greatest gift he could have ever received. It wasn't about wealth or success or status. It was about love, family, and the small, fleeting moments that made life worth living. And as Christmas night fell, wrapping the world in a blanket of peace, Henry knew he had finally found his way home.